The air was thick with excitement as bidders raised their hands, calling out numbers in quick succession. The auction house buzzed with chatter, the scent of hay and old wood lingering in the air. Among the prized horses and purebred dogs being paraded across the stage, there sat a small, scrappy dog, thin, trembling and barely noticed. His fur was patchy, his ribs visible, and his ears drooped as if he had already accepted his fate. Every time the auctioneer called for a bid, silence followed. No one wanted him. The boy sat in the crowd, his small hands gripping the edge of his chair. 9-year-old Ethan wasn't like the other bidders. He didn't have a catalogue in hand, nor did he glance at the sleek, well-groomed animals being sold for hundreds of dollars. His gaze was fixed on the lonely dog sitting at the edge of the stage, looking like he didn't belong. Ethan felt something deep in his heart, an unspoken connection, a pull that he couldn't ignore. The auctioneer sighed, shaking his head. Last call. Anyone? Just a few dollars, folks. Otherwise we move on. Another pause. Another moment of silence. Ethan's fingers twitched as he reached into his pocket. He didn't have much, just the crumpled bills he had saved from doing chores, birthday money folded with care. He knew it wasn't enough for a fancy dog, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough for the one nobody wanted. He stood up, his voice small but firm. I'll take him. A few people chuckled, some exchanged glances, and an older man near the front muttered, "Poor kid. Doesn't know what he's getting into." The auctioneer hesitated. "Son, are you sure? This dog's, well, not in the best shape." Ethan nodded. "I want him." A moment later, the gavel came down with a soft thud. Sold. The boy's heart pounded as he walked toward the stage. The dog didn't move, only staring up at him with tired eyes. Ethan knelt, holding out his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, buddy. Let's go home." The dog flinched at first but didn't pull away. Carefully, Ethan picked him up, feeling how light he was, how his bones pressed against his thin coat. People around them shook their heads, some even whispering that the dog wouldn't last long, that it was a waste of money. But Ethan didn't care. He saw something in the dog that no one else did. As he walked out of the auction house, the dog's frail body rested against his chest, but something had changed. For the first time, there was a flicker of trust in those tired eyes. And neither of them knew it yet, but what happened next would leave everyone speechless. Ethan carried the dog carefully, his small arms wrapped around the frail body as he walked toward his bicycle. The warm afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty road leading away from the auction house. The dog didn't struggle, didn't whimper, just rested against him with a quiet acceptance. It was as if he had given up long ago, too tired to hope for kindness. Ethan's bike was parked under a large oak tree. He placed the dog gently in the basket attached to the front and knelt beside him. "I'm gonna take you home, okay?" he said softly. The dog just blinked, his eyes dull and lifeless. Ethan frowned. He had seen animals before, happy ones wagging their tails, barking, full of energy. But this dog was different. He seemed empty. As he pedaled down the road, the wind rushed past his face. The dog lay still in the basket, only moving when the bike hit a small bump. Ethan glanced down at him every few seconds, wondering what kind of life he had before the auction. Had someone hurt him? Had he always been alone? When he finally reached home, he hopped off the bike and carefully lifted the dog again. His house wasn't big, just a simple place with a small porch and a backyard. His mom was in the garden, watering the plants. She turned when she saw him and the dog in his arms. "Ethan, where did you?" She stopped, her eyes softening when she saw the poor creature. "Oh, honey. I bought him," Ethan said quickly, afraid she might tell him to take the dog back. No one else wanted him. He was just sitting there, all alone. His mom sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the dog, really looked, and something flickered in her eyes. Pity, concern, maybe even understanding. She reached out, gently touching the dog's head. He flinched at first, but when she didn't hurt him, he relaxed just a little. "He's in rough shape, sweetheart." "I know," Ethan said. "But I can take care of him. I promise." His mom studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. But we'll need to take him to the vet first thing in the morning." Ethan grinned. "Thanks, Mom." That night, he made a small bed for the dog in his room. He laid down an old blanket, placed a bowl of water nearby, and sat beside him. The dog didn't eat much, only taking small sips of water. Ethan watched him closely, noticing the scars hidden beneath his thin fur. His ribs stuck out too much. His eyes looked dull, and there was a sadness about him that made Ethan's heart ache. "What happened to you?" he whispered. The dog didn't answer, of course. He just curled up, resting his head on the blanket. Ethan reached out, hesitating before gently placing his hand on the dog's back. He expected him to pull away, but instead the dog let out a soft sigh and stayed still. The next morning, Ethan woke up early. The dog hadn't moved much during the night, but at least he seemed comfortable. His mom drove them to the small vet clinic in town. The place smelled like antiseptic and dog shampoo, and the soft hum of animals waiting filled the air. Dr. Harris, an older man with kind eyes, examined the dog carefully. He checked his teeth, his fur, his paws. He listened to his heart and felt his ribs. Ethan sat on the edge of his seat, waiting for the vet to say something. "He's been through a lot," Dr. Harris finally said, looking at Ethan and his mom. "Malnourished. Probably neglected for a long time." He ran his hand gently over the dog's back. "But he's a fighter. With the right care, he can recover." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "So he's gonna be okay." The vet nodded. "It'll take time, but yes. He just needs love, patience, and good food." Ethan beamed, looking down at the dog. "Did you hear that, buddy? You're gonna be okay." Dr. Harris chuckled. "He just needs a name now." Ethan thought for a moment, then smiled. "Hope." His mom glanced at him, a soft smile on her face. "That's a perfect name." The dog, now called Hope, didn't react much, but Ethan didn't mind. He knew it would take time for him to trust again. The days passed, and Ethan dedicated himself to taking care of Hope. He fed him small meals throughout the day, sat with him in the backyard, and talked to him about everything. School, his favorite movies, his dreams of one day becoming a vet. Hope didn't respond with barks or tail wags, but little by little, Ethan noticed small changes. One morning, as he placed a bowl of food down, Hope actually walked toward it without hesitation. A week ago, he would have waited for Ethan to step away before eating. That day, he ate while Ethan sat beside him, and it felt like a huge victory. Another time, while they were outside, Ethan tossed a small ball across the yard. Hope didn't chase it, but his ears twitched, and he lifted his head slightly. It wasn't much, but Ethan took it as progress. But something still felt off. Hope was improving slowly, but there was a heaviness about him, like a shadow that followed him everywhere. It wasn't just the neglect, there was something else. One evening, as Ethan was brushing Hope's fur, he felt a rough patch near his neck. He leaned in closer, gently parting the fur, and his breath caught in his throat. There was an old scar there, faint but deep. And it wasn't the kind that came from an accident. It looked like a mark left behind by something tight, something that had been wrapped around his neck too long. Collar. A bad feeling settled in Ethan's stomach. He had assumed Hope had been abandoned, neglected. But now he wasn't so sure. His mom noticed his expression. "Ethan, what's wrong?" He looked up at her, his voice quiet. "I think someone hurt him." She frowned, kneeling beside him. When she saw the scar, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Oh, sweetheart." Ethan swallowed. "Do you think someone's looking for him?" His mom hesitated. "If they are, we'll find out." Ethan nodded, but a strange feeling crept into his chest. A part of him didn't want anyone to come looking for Hope, because deep down, he feared that whoever had him before wasn't someone who loved him. And if they did come back, what would happen then? That night, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of his discovery sat heavy on his chest. The scar around Hope's neck wasn't just a sign of neglect. It was proof that someone had restrained him, controlled him. The thought made his stomach twist. What if that person wanted him back? Hope lay curled up on the blanket beside Ethan's bed. He was breathing softly, finally at ease after weeks of careful care. Ethan didn't want to imagine him going back to wherever he had come from. He had never thought about what happened to the animals before they ended up at auctions, but now he couldn't stop. The next morning, as Ethan walked Hope outside, he noticed something unusual. A truck had pulled up across the street, a dark, dented vehicle with a muddy license plate. The driver stayed inside, but Ethan could feel the weight of their gaze. He tried to shake the feeling off, but when he looked back again, the truck was still there, watching. Hope suddenly stiffened, his ears pressing flat against his head. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. "Come on, buddy," he whispered, leading him back inside. As soon as the door shut, Hope curled up in the corner, his body tense. Ethan peeked through the window, but the truck was gone. Had it been his imagination? Later that day, he decided to visit Dr. Harris again. Maybe the vet had seen Hope before, maybe he could help figure out where he came from. His mom drove them to the clinic, and as soon as they stepped inside, Dr. Harris gave them a welcoming smile. "Hope's looking better already," he said, kneeling beside the dog. "Eating well." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but I found something." He hesitated before explaining about the scar, the way Hope flinched at certain sounds, and the strange truck that had been parked outside. Dr. Harris listened carefully, his expression growing serious. "You said he came from an auction, right?" "Yeah." The vet sighed, standing up. "Sometimes animals at auctions aren't just abandoned. Some come from bad situations. People who mistreat animals, use them for the wrong reasons. And when they're done, they get rid of them." Ethan felt his stomach turn. "You mean, someone dumped him there?" Dr. Harris nodded. "It's possible. And if someone was mistreating him before, they might not want him found." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He looked down at Hope, who was resting his head on his paws. How much had this dog been through before finding his way to him? And what if the person who hurt him wasn't ready to let go? On the way home, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He glanced at every car they passed, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat. His mom noticed. "You okay, sweetheart? What if someone comes looking for Hope?" His voice was quiet. "What if they want him back?" His mom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "If someone like that shows up, we'll do the right thing. We'll protect him." Ethan nodded, but the worry in his chest didn't go away. That evening, as he sat outside with Hope, a thought crossed his mind. What if Hope remembered something? What if there was a way to know where he had been? He watched as Hope sniffed the ground, his nose twitching as if searching for something familiar. "Do you know where you came from?" Ethan asked softly. The dog looked up at him, tilting his head slightly. It was probably a silly question, but Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe if they retraced Hope's steps, they could figure out the truth. The next morning, Ethan grabbed his bike and gently placed Hope in the front basket, just like the first day. "We're going on a little trip," he whispered. He didn't tell his mom. He knew she'd worry. He just wanted to look around, see if anything felt familiar to Hope. He pedaled toward the auction house first. Hope stayed quiet the whole ride, his eyes scanning the road ahead. When they reached the old wooden barn where the auction had taken place, Ethan parked his bike and stepped inside with Hope by his side. The place was empty now, the smell of hay still lingering in the air. Ethan walked slowly, letting Hope take the lead. At first, the dog seemed unsure, but then his ears perked up. He sniffed the ground, his body tensing slightly. Ethan followed as Hope led him toward the back of the barn, near the old wooden stalls. He hesitated for a moment before scratching at the ground. Ethan knelt beside him, brushing away loose straw and dirt. That's when he saw it, a broken piece of leather, half buried in the dust. Collar. Ethan's fingers trembled as he picked it up. It was worn, the metal buckle rusted. He turned it over, and his breath caught in his throat. There were initials carved into the leather. Faint but still visible. Jar. Hope let out a soft whimper, backing away slightly. Ethan's heart pounded. Jar. Who was that? Was it the person who had hurt Hope? The one who had abandoned him? Before he could think any further, a noise made him freeze. A step. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. Ethan quickly stuffed the collar into his pocket and grabbed Hope's leash. His heart raced as he turned toward the exit, but before he could take another step, a shadow fell across the doorway. A man stood there, blocking the way. His eyes were sharp, his face worn with deep lines. He didn't smile, didn't move. He just stared at Hope. Ethan's grip on the leash tightened. His chest felt tight, his mind racing. The man tilted his head slightly. "That's my dog." Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. Hope stood stiff beside him, his body tense, his tail tucked between his legs. He wasn't just afraid, he was terrified. Ethan knew in that moment that this man was the reason Hope had scars, the reason he had been starving, broken, abandoned. And now he wanted him back. But Ethan also knew one more thing. He wasn't going to let that happen. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he thought the man might hear it. Hope stood frozen beside him, his body stiff as if every muscle was preparing for something bad. The man in the doorway didn't move at first. He just stared. His eyes locked onto Hope in a way that sent a chill through Ethan's body. "That's my dog," the man repeated, his voice low, almost calm. But there was something in it, something cold, something that didn't feel right. Ethan's fingers tightened around the leash. "No, he's not." His voice was small, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "I got him at the auction. No one wanted him." The man took a slow step forward, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. "He wasn't supposed to be at that auction. Someone must have taken him from me." Hope let out a small, barely audible whimper, his tail curling under his belly. Ethan could feel the dog trembling next to him. It was the most movement he'd shown since the man appeared. Ethan swallowed. "If he was yours, why does he have scars?" His voice shook, but he didn't look away. Why was he starving? The man's expression darkened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward. "Listen, kid. I don't got time for this. Just give me the dog, and we won't have a problem." Ethan instinctively stepped back, pulling Hope with him. His mind was racing. He couldn't just hand Hope over. He couldn't let him go back to whatever life he had escaped from. But what could he do? The man was taller, stronger. If he tried to run, would he even make it to the door in time? Hope let out a low, shaky breath. Ethan could feel him pressing closer, as if he knew that whatever was happening wasn't safe. I have to go," Ethan said quickly, turning toward the exit on the other side of the barn. But before he could take a step, the man moved faster than he expected. A hand grabbed his wrist. Ethan gasped, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to pull away, but the grip was tight. Not painful but firm. "Just give me the dog," the man said again, his voice lower now, less patient. Hope let out a soft growl, not loud, not aggressive, but enough to make the man hesitate for just a second. And in that second, Ethan yanked his arm free and bolted. "Hope, come on," he shouted, running toward the open back door of the barn. His legs moved before he could think, his feet pounding against the dusty floor. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He could hear the man behind him, his footsteps heavy and fast. Hope ran right beside him, his paws kicking up dirt. He wasn't fast. His body was still weak from weeks of recovery, but he ran anyway. Ethan could hear the man's voice behind him, cursing under his breath. Ethan reached the bike, his hands fumbling as he tried to lift Hope into the basket. His heart was hammering. He knew he didn't have time. Then he heard it. The sound of the truck's engine roaring to life. The same truck from the day before. The realization hit him like a wave. The man had been watching, waiting. He hadn't just run into Ethan at the barn by accident. He had been looking for Hope. Ethan's stomach twisted. He jumped onto his bike, his hands shaking as he gripped the handlebars. The truck's tires crunched against the gravel as it turned toward him. Hope whimpered in the basket, his ears flat against his head. Ethan pushed off, pedaling as hard as he could. The road stretched out ahead of him, but the truck was faster, its engine rumbling behind him. He didn't know where to go. The town was still far, his house even farther. He had never been more scared in his life, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let the man catch them. The truck sped up, closing the distance between them. Ethan's legs burned as he pushed harder, his breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. The road ahead had a sharp turn, leading into a wooded path. It wasn't meant for bikes, but right now he didn't care. He swerved, his tires skidding slightly as he veered off the road and onto the dirt path. Leaves and branches brushed against his arms as he pedaled through the trees, his heart racing. The truck wouldn't be able to follow him here, not easily at least. The sound of the engine faded slightly, but Ethan knew the man wasn't giving up. He wouldn't stop. Hope let out a small, scared whimper, and Ethan reached down with one hand to touch his head. "It's okay, buddy," he panted. "We're gonna be okay." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if it was true. Ethan kept pedaling, his legs burning with every push forward. The dirt path was uneven, scattered with rocks and fallen branches, but he didn't slow down. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear anything else. Hope was curled up in the basket, his body tense, his wide eyes darting around as if he knew danger was close behind them. The sound of the truck had faded for now, but Ethan knew it wasn't over. The man wasn't the type to give up easily. If he had been watching them for days, waiting for the right moment, then he wouldn't stop now, not when he was this close. The path curved sharply ahead, disappearing into thicker trees. Ethan didn't know where it led, but he had no choice but to follow it. As he rounded the bend, the bike's tires skidded slightly, kicking up dust. His breath came in quick, sharp gasps. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the man's shadow moving through the trees, but there was nothing. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves, the distant chirping of birds. Maybe, just maybe, he had lost him. Then Hope tensed. It happened in an instant. 1 second, Ethan was gripping the handlebars, trying to catch his breath. The next, Hope was whining, low and urgent. Ethan barely had time to react before something grabbed the back of his shirt, yanking him off balance. He gasped as he tumbled off the bike, hitting the ground hard. The dirt scraped against his skin, and the wind was knocked from his lungs. Hope yelped as the bike tipped over, the basket hitting the ground with a dull thud. Ethan barely had time to process what had happened before he felt it, a presence looming over him. He looked up. The man wasn't behind him anymore. He was here, right here. Ethan's heart felt like it had stopped. The man must have cut through the trees, taken a different route. He stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes locked onto Ethan with something dark, something unreadable. His jaw was clenched, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Hope scrambled out of the basket, his legs unsteady. He didn't run, he just stood there, frozen, staring at the man with wide, terrified eyes. "I told you," the man said, his voice quieter now but somehow even more dangerous. "That's my dog." Ethan tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy. His mind was screaming at him to move, to do something, but his body wouldn't listen. The man took a step closer. Hope made a sound, something between a growl and a whimper. He didn't bare his teeth, didn't bark, but his entire body trembled. The man glanced at him, then back at Ethan. His eyes narrowed. "You think you're saving him, kid?" His voice was sharp now, edged with something bitter. "You don't know a thing about that dog." Ethan swallowed hard. "I know he's scared of you," he said. His voice barely more than a whisper. "I know you hurt him." The man let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. "You don't understand." His voice was tight, controlled. "That dog, he wasn't just mine. He was trained. He was worth something. And then someone stole him from me." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Trained?" He looked at Hope again, at the way he flinched at sudden movements, the way he never barked, never played like other dogs. Pieces of the puzzle started clicking together, forming a picture Ethan didn't like. Hope hadn't just been abandoned. He hadn't just been neglected. He had been used. The man's voice dropped lower, almost a growl. "You don't get it, do you? That dog was made to follow orders. And when he didn't..." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I spent years training him. And now he's mine again." Ethan's chest tightened. Hope wasn't just afraid of this man. He had been controlled by him. The leash, the scars, the way he never made a sound. It all made sense now. The man hadn't just owned Hope. He had broken him. Hope whimpered softly, taking a small step back. Ethan knew he was remembering. Knew he was reliving something Ethan couldn't even imagine. "No," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "You don't get to take him back." The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "And what are you gonna do about it?" Ethan didn't know. He had never felt so powerless before. He was just a kid. The man was stronger, faster. If he grabbed Hope now, Ethan wouldn't be able to stop him. Hope's breathing was quick and shallow. Ethan could see the panic in his eyes. But then, just for a second, Hope looked at him. And Ethan realized something. Hope had spent his whole life being controlled. Being told what to do, how to move, when to be silent. He had been scared for so long. But right now, at this moment, Ethan wasn't the only one who had a choice to make. Hope did too. Ethan took a deep breath and forced himself to stand. His legs were shaking, but he didn't back down. "Hope," he whispered, his voice steady. "You don't have to listen to him." Hope's ears twitched. His body was still trembling, but his eyes stayed locked on Ethan. The man scoffed. "He's not gonna listen to you, kid. He doesn't know how." Ethan ignored him. He crouched slightly, reaching out his hand. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said softly. "You're not his. You never were." Hope blinked, his tail twitching just slightly. The man let out a frustrated growl. "Enough of this." He stepped forward, reaching for Hope's leash. And then, Hope moved. Not backward. Not toward the man. But forward. Toward Ethan. Hope pressed himself against Ethan's leg. His entire body shaking, but he stayed there. Chose to be there. The man stopped mid-step. His expression darkened. "You think this changes anything?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't just running. He was standing his ground. And so was Hope. The man's eyes darkened as he stared at Hope, who stood firm beside Ethan. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. He had expected the dog to obey, to fall back under his control like before. But Hope didn't move. He stayed right where he was. Ethan could feel Hope's body shaking, but there was something different now, something stronger. He wasn't just afraid anymore. He was choosing. The man took another step forward, but Ethan didn't back down this time. "You can't take him," Ethan said, his voice steadier than before. The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't understand, kid. That dog isn't a pet. He was trained for a purpose." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, keeping his hand on Hope's back. Maybe he was. But he's not anymore. The man's expression shifted, and for the first time, there was something almost uncertain in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to being told no. But then his face hardened again. You think you can just decide that? Ethan didn't answer. He just held his ground. Hope let out a quiet breath and did something that made Ethan's heart tighten. He leaned into him. Not in fear, not because he was hiding, but because he had chosen to. The man's patience snapped. Enough of this, he muttered, reaching for Hope's collar. And that's when Hope moved. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't aggression. But as the man's hand stretched toward him, Hope did something Ethan had never seen him do before. He barked. It was loud, sharp, filled with something powerful. A sound that had been silenced for too long. The man froze. Hope barked again, his body low, his ears flat, but there was no fear in his stance, only defiance. The man hesitated just for a second. And that second was enough. Ethan grabbed Hope's leash and stepped back, his heart pounding. "Run, Hope," he shouted. Hope didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, his legs stronger than they had ever been. Ethan followed, his feet barely touching the ground as he sprinted down the path. He could hear the man shouting behind them, but he didn't stop to look back. Branches whipped past him, the wind roared in his ears. His lungs burned, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. The trees began to thin, and Ethan saw the road ahead. His house wasn't far now. If they could just... The sound of tires screeching made his stomach drop. The truck had circled around. Ethan barely had time to react before he saw it speeding toward them. The man had planned for this. He knew they would run. Hope skidded to a stop, his paws kicking up dust. The truck's headlights flashed as it swerved in front of them, blocking the path. Ethan's breath caught. They were trapped. The man jumped out of the truck, his face twisted with frustration. "I'm done playing games," he growled. "You don't get it, kid. That dog." A sudden sound cut through the air. Sirens. Loud, sharp, getting closer. The man's entire body tensed. He turned his head, his expression shifting from anger to something else, something Ethan had never seen on him before. Panic. Flashing red and blue lights appeared at the end of the road, getting closer by the second. Police car. Ethan's chest heaved as he realized. His mom. She must have called them when she realized he was gone. The man's gaze darted between Ethan, Hope, and the approaching car. He hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. He knew he was out of time. Without another word, he turned and sprinted back to the truck. The tires screeched as he threw it into reverse, dirt flying up behind him. He sped off down the road, disappearing into the distance just as the police car skidded to a stop. Ethan collapsed onto his knees, gasping for breath. Hope pressed against him, his chest rising and falling quickly, but he wasn't shaking anymore. The officer stepped out, his radio crackling. "You okay, kid?" Ethan nodded, his arms tightening around Hope. "Yeah," he breathed. "We're okay." But just as relief started to settle in, something unexpected happened. Hope let out another bark, this one softer, almost questioning. He was looking past Ethan, his ears perked up. Ethan turned, following his gaze. Lying in the dirt near the truck's tire tracks was something small, something half buried in dust. Ethan's stomach twisted as he realized what it was. A metal tag. He reached for it with shaky fingers, brushing off the dirt. The engraving was worn, but still readable. It wasn't Hope's name. It was another dog. Another one just like him. Ethan's blood ran cold. The man hadn't just trained Hope. There were more. Hope let out a soft whimper, nudging Ethan's arm. His eyes were wide, not in fear but in understanding. Ethan swallowed hard. He had thought this was over, that the nightmare had ended. But now, staring at that metal tag in his palm, he knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Ethan stared at the metal tag in his palm, his breath shaky. The name etched into it was unfamiliar, but the weight of it felt heavy, like it carried a secret he wasn't supposed to know. Hope pressed his nose against Ethan's arm, his warm breath grounding him for a moment. The police officer was speaking, asking him questions, but Ethan's mind was spinning. Hope wasn't the only one. There were others. Ethan looked up at the officer, his voice coming out quieter than he expected. "There are more dogs," he said. He had more. The officer's expression shifted, his brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" Ethan held up the tag, his fingers curling around the edges. Hope wasn't the only one he trained. "There's another dog. Maybe more." His voice grew stronger. "We have to find them." The officer took the tag, studying it before nodding. "We'll look into it." He spoke into his radio, calling in for backup. Ethan felt his mom before he saw her. A rush of warmth, of arms pulling him in, holding him so tightly he almost couldn't breathe. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so scared." "I'm okay," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. His heart was still racing, and his mind was stuck on everything that had just happened. His mom pulled back, cupping his face in her hands. "What happened? Why did you leave?" Ethan glanced down at Hope, whose eyes were still locked on the tag the officer held. He had spent so long being afraid, but now, for the first time, there was something else in his gaze. Quiet determination. "I had to," Ethan said simply. "I had to protect him." His mom looked at Hope, then back at Ethan, understanding flickering in her eyes. She took a deep breath, squeezing his hand. "Let's go home." The ride back was quiet. Hope sat in the back seat, curled up but alert, his ears twitching at every passing sound. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what had almost happened, how close they had come to losing each other. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Ethan felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him. His body ached from running, his mind was drained, but Hope was safe. That was all that mattered. Hope hesitated at the doorway, his paws hovering just over the threshold. Ethan kneeled beside him, stroking his fur gently. "It's okay," he said. "This is your home now." Hope's tail gave a small, uncertain wag. Then slowly he stepped inside. Days passed, and things started to settle. The police searched for the man, tracking his movements, trying to find out if there were more dogs like Hope. Ethan kept the metal tag on his nightstand, a reminder of the ones still out there. He didn't know if they would ever find them, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't stop hoping. Hope was changing too. He was still quiet, still cautious, but there were moments, small ones, where the fear melted away. He started to trust. Play. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch, watching as Hope lay in the grass, staring up at the sky. "You're free now," Ethan said softly. Hope turned his head, his eyes meeting Ethan's. And then, for the first time, he wagged his tail, fully, happily. Ethan smiled. The past would always be a part of Hope, but it wouldn't define him. Not anymore.